In the winter of 1947, a small propeller plane lifted off a frozen lake somewhere north of 60, carrying supplies to a mining camp that no road had ever reached. There was no runway, no tower, no ground crew, just ice, spruce trees, and silence broken by an engine built to handle all three. That plane was not American. It was not British. It was designed in a hangar on the edge of Toronto by Canadian engineers who understood something no one else did. That a country this vast, this cold, this disconnected from itself needed a different kind of aircraft entirely. They built it. Then they built another, then another after that. And for 30 years, those planes did what railways and highways could not. They opened the north. Then the company was sold, and sold again, and the name that built all of it quietly disappeared. De Havilland Canada did not begin as a Canadian idea. It began as a branch plant, a colonial outpost of a British manufacturer that needed somewhere to assemble aircraft closer to a growing market. In 1928, the parent company opened a facility at Downsview, on the northern edge of Toronto, expecting to build British designs for British customers who happened to live in Canada. That was the plan. It did not survive contact with the country itself. Canada in 1928 was not Britain. It was not even close. The settled South was a thin ribbon of farms and cities pressed against the American border. Everything above it was something else entirely. Shield Rock and Muskeg, and rivers that ran for hundreds of miles without passing a single town. A country larger than the entire European continent, with roads that stopped where the trees got serious. The engineers at Downsview looked at that map and began to understand that the aircraft being designed in London had nothing to do with the problem in front of them. The Second World War accelerated everything. De Havilland Canada spent the war years producing Tiger Moths and Mosquito bombers under license, turning a modest assembly operation into a full industrial plant. Thousands of workers, precision manufacturing, supply chains that ran deep into Ontario's industrial base. By 1945, Downsview was no longer a branch plant in any meaningful sense. It was a factory that knew how to build aircraft, and it had a workforce that knew how to think about them. What came next was the result of that thinking. The engineers at De Havilland Canada looked at the bush pilots who were quietly doing the impossible every day across the Northern Territories. Men landing on sandbars and beaver ponds, carrying mail and medicine and dynamite to places that existed on no commercial route. They were flying pre-war designs held together by expertise and improvisation, aircraft that were never meant for what they were being asked to do. The engineers took note. The decision to design an original Canadian aircraft, one built from scratch around the actual conditions of the actual country, was not obvious. It required confidence that a branch plant operation in Toronto could produce something the world did not yet have. It required engineers willing to go north and ask questions instead of staying south and making assumptions. And it required a kind of institutional stubbornness, a belief that Canada's geography was not a problem to be worked around, but a specification to be met. That stubbornness produced something remarkable. It produced the Beaver. Before a single blueprint was drawn, the engineers at De Havilland Canada did something unusual. They went and asked. They talked to bush pilots in the Northwest Territories and Northern Ontario, to mining company operators running supply lines into the Shield, to forestry crews and missionary pilots, and anyone else who depended on small aircraft to do work that had no other solution. The question was simple. What does the perfect bush plane look like? The answers were not. It needed to take off in 300 feet. It needed to land on water on snow, on grass, on gravel, switching between all four with nothing more than an afternoon and a set of basic tools. It needed to carry more than its size suggested. It needed to start in temperatures that stopped everything else. It needed to be fixed in the field by a mechanic with limited parts and no manual. It needed, above everything else, to be reliable in conditions where unreliable meant dead. The DHC-2 Beaver first flew in August of 1947. It was not a beautiful aircraft by the standards of the post-war jet age. It was square and purposeful, high-winged and sturdy, with a wide cabin door and fixed undercarriage that could be swapped for floats or skis in the time it took to eat lunch. The Pratt & Whitney Wasp Junior engine up front was chosen because Bush mechanics across the North already knew how to rebuild it in their sleep. Nothing about the Beaver was accidental. Everything about it was earned. The United States Army adopted it almost immediately. During the Korean War, American commanders discovered that the Beaver could do things their own light aircraft could not, operating from unprepared strips in conditions that grounded everything else. By the mid-1950s, the U.S. military was the largest single customer for an aircraft designed in Toronto for Canadian lakes. The irony was not lost on anyone at Downsview. Back in Canada, the Beaver was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Mining claims that existed only on paper became operating sites. Communities above the tree line that received supplies once a season began receiving them once a week. Nurses and teachers and priests reached places that had been effectively unreachable. The North did not open because of a policy or a program. It opened because a reliable aircraft could land on the lake behind the settlement and take off again an hour later. Production ran until 1967. 1,657 Beavers were built. Dozens are still flying today because nothing better has been invented for the job they were designed to do. The Beaver proved something important. A Canadian aircraft designed around Canadian conditions could compete anywhere in the world. De Havilland. Canada did not celebrate that fact for long. They used it as a starting point and kept building. The DHC-3 Otter arrived in 1951, 4 years after the Beaver's first flight. The logic was straightforward. Everything the Beaver could do, the Otter could do with twice the payload. Same STOL performance, same interchangeable undercarriage, same philosophy of absolute reliability in impossible conditions. Where the Beaver opened a mining camp, the Otter supplied it. Where the Beaver carried a doctor, the Otter carried a hospital's worth of equipment. The Canadian Army adopted it. So did the United States Navy. So did operators on every continent where the terrain was unforgiving and the runways were theoretical. But the leap that changed everything came in 1965 with the DHC-6 Twin Otter. 2 Pratt & Whitney turboprop engines instead of 1 piston. A reliability that let small regional airlines operate scheduled service into strips that major carriers would not touch with a long-haul jet. The Twin Otter was not a bush plane in the traditional sense. It was a system. It could serve a remote indigenous community in the morning, reposition to a gravel airstrip in the afternoon, and turn up at a small regional airport by evening, all on the same airframe without complaint. More than 900 Twin Otters were built before the original production line closed. They flew in over 100 countries. They supplied Antarctic research stations. They operated in the Maldives, in Nepal, in Papua New Guinea, in places where the combination of short runways and difficult weather made every other option irrelevant. No aircraft before or since has served that specific role with the same combination of simplicity and capability. Then came the Dash 8 in 1983, and the scale shifted again. This was not a bush plane. This was a 37-seat regional turboprop aimed at the commercial airline market, competing with European and American manufacturers on their own terms. De Havilland Canada had traveled in 35 years from a colonial assembly operation to a company producing competitive commercial aircraft sold to airlines around the world. That trajectory was not accidental. It was the product of a specific institutional culture, one that started every design project by asking what the country actually needed, then building the answer from scratch. 3 decades, 4 aircraft families, 1 consistent idea. The remarkable thing is not that it worked. The remarkable thing is that it all came from the same hangar on the edge of Toronto. By the early 1970s, de Havilland Canada was in financial trouble. The development costs of the Dash 7, an ambitious 4-engine STOL airliner aimed at city center airports, had stretched the company past its limits. In 1974, the federal government stepped in and bought it. The logic was familiar. A strategic industrial asset, one that employed thousands of skilled workers and carried decades of accumulated expertise, was worth preserving with public money. Ottawa agreed, and de Havilland Canada became a crown corporation. It did not stay one for long. In 1986, the Mulroney government decided that the business of government was not building aircraft. De Havilland Canada was put up for sale. Boeing made an offer. $90 million for a company that had spent 30 years building aircraft the world could not replicate and accumulating intellectual property that no amount of money could quickly reproduce. The price was low. The government accepted it anyway. Boeing's interest was narrow and specific. The Dash 8 had a future in the regional airline market that was expanding fast. The facilities at Downsview were modern and capable. Everything else, the bushplane legacy, the STOL expertise, the institutional knowledge that lived in the heads of engineers who had spent careers solving problems no one else had even identified, was peripheral. Boeing did not invest in new development. It did not chase the markets the Beaver and Twin Otter had built. It managed an asset it did not fully understand, applying Seattle's industrial logic to a company whose entire identity had been built on doing the opposite of what Seattle would have done. 6 years was long enough to confirm the mismatch. In 1992, Boeing sold de Havilland Canada to Bombardier for just under $150 million. Bombardier was a Quebec success story that had moved aggressively into aerospace through acquisition, and the de Havilland purchase gave it a complete regional aircraft portfolio. The Dash 8 became the Q series, and Bombardier invested in it seriously, developing new variants and selling aggressively into the global regional airline market. On those terms, the acquisition worked, but the rest of the legacy was set aside. The Beaver was gone from production. The Twin Otter line had already closed in 1988 under Boeing. Downsview became a production facility for one aircraft family, rather than the innovation engine it had once been. The name de Havilland Canada faded from Bombardier's marketing. The brand that had meant something specific, that had carried the weight of a particular kind of Canadian ingenuity, was quietly absorbed into a larger corporate identity that had no particular use for it. Bombardier held the de Havilland Canada assets for nearly 3 decades, but the story did not end there. It ended in pieces, sold off as Bombardier itself ran into trouble. The company had overextended on the C-Series, a narrow-body jet program that consumed billions and nearly broke the business. By the late 2010s, Bombardier was selling everything that was not essential to its survival. The Q-Series turboprop division went in 2019 to Longview Aviation Capital, a British Columbia holding company that already owned Viking Air, the firm that had purchased the type certificates for the Beaver, the Otter, and the Twin Otter years earlier. Longview did something that looked, on the surface, like a restoration. They brought the de Havilland Canada name back, registered it, printed it on letterhead, announced that the brand would live again under Canadian ownership. In some ways, this was genuine. The Twin Otter Series 400 was back in production in Victoria, updated with modern avionics and new engines, but recognizable as the same essential aircraft that had first flown in 1965. Orders came in. The line was real, but Downsview was gone. The facility where the Beaver had been designed and the Dash 8 had been built was sold to a development consortium and eventually transferred to a federal lands corporation. Today, it is Downsview Park, a green space on the north side of Toronto, where families walk dogs on what used to be a test flight runway. The hangars where engineers once solved problems that no one else had thought to address are gone or converted. The physical infrastructure of that particular industrial culture does not exist anymore. What remains is a brand and a type certificate and a production line in Victoria that builds a few dozen aircraft a year for operators who have no alternative. That is not nothing. The Twin Otter is still the best answer to a specific question, and the fact that someone is still building it matters to the communities that depend on it. But it is not de Havilland Canada in any meaningful sense. It is a name attached to a legacy that the name alone cannot carry. Canada's civil aviation industry followed the same arc as its automotive industry, its agricultural equipment industry, its locomotive industry. Built by Canadians, solving Canadian problems, achieving global relevance, then sold, restructured, hollowed out, and reduced to a trademark. The expertise dispersed. The institutions dissolved. The country retained the nostalgia without retaining the capacity. A Beaver still lands on a lake in the Yukon every morning. The company that imagined it is a park. The plane that opened Canada's north is still flying. That is the remarkable part. 70 years on, the Beaver lands on the same lakes, carries the same kinds of loads, serves the same remote communities that no road has ever reached. The aircraft outlasted the company. It outlasted every corporate structure that bought and sold and renamed what was built at Downsview. Some things are simply too well made to disappear, but the engineers who made them, the institution that trained them, the industrial culture that produced 30 years of uninterrupted innovation, that is gone. What Canada built, Canada could not keep.